The gun was already pressed against Minnie Boone's temple when she realized the man she had trusted with every secret she owned had been lying to her from the very first day they met. "You thought I loved you," Victor Crane said softly, and the softness of his voice was more terrifying than any shout could have been. He stood in the pale doorway of the Dusthaven jailhouse, his silhouette carved black against the blazing New Mexico sun, the revolver steady in his grip as though he had been practicing this moment for a very long time. "You thought you were special, Minnie. That was your mistake." Minnie did not tremble. She had promised herself years ago that she would never let a man see her tremble, and she held that promise now even as her heart cracked clean down the middle. She could feel the cold metal ring of the barrel at her skin, could smell the gunpowder already embedded in its steel from previous shots, could hear the distant sound of Dusthaven going about its morning business outside these walls, entirely unaware that she was about to die. "Where is the deed?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was almost proud of it. Victor smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and she hated it. "You brought it with you. You always were too honest for your own good." She had brought it. The land deed to her father's 300 acres outside of Copper Ridge. The deed she had carried all the way from Missouri because Victor had told her it needed to be registered at the territorial office in Dusthaven. She had believed him. She had believed everything he told her, including the part where he said he intended to marry her. The door behind Victor opened without warning, and everything changed. He came through the door like weather, like something that could not be argued with. Amos Whitfield stood 6 feet 2 inches in worn boots, with a Marshal's badge on his chest that caught the morning light and threw it back sharp. His dark eyes found the scene in an instant, reading it the way a man reads a trail, and his hand was already at his hip though he had not yet drawn. "Victor," he said, "just the name, nothing else." Victor turned his head, and in that half-second of distraction Minnie dropped. She had not planned it. Her body simply understood before her mind did that the moment had opened, and she threw herself sideways and down onto the dusty jailhouse floor, and Victor's grip on her was gone, and then there was shouting and a struggle, and the sound of something heavy striking wood, and when she finally looked up, gasping, Amos Whitfield had Victor Crane pinned face first against the far wall with both arms wrenched behind his back. "You are under arrest," Amos said, breathing hard, and his voice was completely without theater. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. That was the beginning, though Minnie would not understand until much later how much of an ending it also was, and how much of a beginning it truly made. 6 weeks earlier, Minnie Boone had still been in St. Joseph, Missouri, sitting at the small table in her father's kitchen with a letter in her hands that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Her father, Thomas Boone, had died on a Tuesday in the middle of March, 1882, leaving behind 300 acres of grazing land in the New Mexico Territory, a mule named Gerald who had the temperament of a disappointed senator, and a handwritten will that gave everything to his only child. Minnie was 24 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had been teaching school in St. Joseph for 2 years, which was long enough to know that she did not particularly want to spend the rest of her life there. The letter in her hands was from a man named Victor Crane, who described himself as her father's business partner. He explained, in precise and courteous language, that the land was worth considerably more than her father had likely realized, that there were mining interests in the area who would pay handsomely for the mineral rights, and that he would be happy to help her navigate the territorial registration process if she wished to come to Dusthaven in person. He had enclosed a second letter, this one shorter and warmer, which expressed that he had heard a great deal about her from her father, and that he looked forward to making her acquaintance. He signed it, "With sincere and hopeful regards, Victor." She read it 3 times. She was 24 and alone, and her father had just died, and the land was all she had, and she read something in that second letter that was not entirely about business. She was not naive. But she was lonely in the way that a person can be lonely when the last anchor they had to the life they knew has been cut free. She wrote back. She began packing a week later. The journey from St. Joseph to Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory, took 11 days by rail and stage. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early April 1882, when the desert was doing its brief and furious spring, when everything bloomed at once in colors that seemed too saturated to be real. Dusthaven was a proper town by frontier standards, with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a general store, a hotel called the Copper Crown, a church that was also occasionally used as a courthouse, and a marshal's office at the east end of the street. Victor Crane met her at the stage stop. He was 30 years old and handsome in a careful, deliberate way, the way a man is handsome when he has worked at it. He had pale blue eyes and a charming smile, and he shook her hand and offered to carry her trunk and said all the right things. He had arranged a room for her at the Copper Crown. He suggested dinner that evening at the hotel's small dining room to discuss business at her convenience. She said yes. She unpacked her trunk and changed her dress and sat on the edge of the hotel bed and felt the particular loneliness of arriving somewhere entirely new where no one yet knew your name. At dinner, Victor was attentive and warm. He explained the situation carefully. The land her father had registered informally needed to be processed through the Territorial Land Office, a bureaucratic matter that would take perhaps 2 weeks. In the meantime, he would introduce her to the community, show her the lay of the territory, help her understand what she had inherited. He spoke about her father with apparent fondness. He made her laugh twice. When he walked her back to the hotel, he held her hand briefly at the door and she let him. She told herself it was because she was lonely and because the desert night was enormous and cold above her, and not because she had already begun to imagine something that was not only about land registration. She met Amos Whitfield the following morning. She was crossing the main street toward the general store when she heard raised voices and stopped to see a man being dragged out of the saloon at the early hour of 9 in the morning, protesting loudly that he had not started anything and that the other fellow had asked for it. The man doing the dragging was Amos Whitfield, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who does not need to rush because he is quite sure of the outcome. He deposited the drunk in the street, told him to go home and sleep, and turned around to head back toward the marshal's office, and that was when he saw Minnie standing on the opposite boardwalk watching him with undisguised curiosity. He touched the brim of his hat. It was a simple, economical gesture. She nodded back. She noticed his eyes, which were very dark and very direct, and looked at her without any of the performance she was already accustomed to from Victor Crane. She went into the general store and bought soap and a box of writing paper and did not think about the marshal further. Or she told herself she did not think about him. Victor came for her every afternoon that first week. He showed her around the territory on horseback, riding out to the edge of her father's land so she could see what she had inherited, the wide rolling plains with their thin spring grass, the rocky ridge to the north that gave Copper Ridge its name. He was always gentlemanly and always attentive, and at some point during the third afternoon, out on the open land with the sky enormous above them, he reached across and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and said she was the most remarkable woman he had met in the territory. She let herself believe it. This is important to understand. She was not stupid and she was not without instinct, but grief is a particular kind of loneliness, and loneliness makes a person reach for warmth wherever they can find it, and Victor Crane was offering warmth in both hands. It was on the 5th day that she had her first real conversation with Amos Whitfield. She was sitting on the bench outside the Copper Crown in the early evening, writing a letter to her friend Clara back in St. Joseph, when he came walking down the boardwalk on his evening round. He slowed when he saw her and she looked up and he said, "Evening, Miss Boone," and she said, "You know my name," and he said, "I make it my business to know who's in town," and she said, "Is that so?" and he said it was, and then instead of continuing his round, he sat down on the far end of the bench and looked out at the street. They sat in silence for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who are both comfortable with quiet. "How are you finding Dusthaven?" he asked finally. "Hot," she said, "and brown, but also unexpectedly beautiful." He nodded as if she had said something he agreed with. "How long do you intend to stay?" "Until the land registration is sorted. 2 weeks, Mr. Crane says." Something shifted in his expression when she said Victor's name. It was very subtle, barely a thing at all, a slight tightening around the eyes. "Victor Crane is helping you with that. He was my father's business partner." "I see," he said, and then after a pause, "If you have any trouble, Miss Boone, you know where the Marshal's office is." She looked at him then, really looked at him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with weathered skin and those very direct dark eyes and a jaw that could have been used to make a point in an argument. He was not handsome in the way Victor was handsome, the kind that announces itself. He was handsome in the way that certain landscapes are, a kind that takes time to fully see. "What kind of trouble?" she asked. "The territory kind," he said, and stood, and touched the brim of his hat again and continued his round. She watched him go and felt something she could not quite name settle in her chest, something quiet and unresolved, like a question asked in an empty room. She saw Victor every day. She saw Amos on occasion, passing in the street, the brief hat touch, the direct eyes. The contrast between them grew sharper the more she noticed it. Victor was always performing something. She began to understand, always positioning himself, always calibrating his warmth for maximum effect. Amos Whitfield simply was what he was, a man who took up exactly the space he occupied and no more. It was in the second week that she found the document. Victor had left her at the Territorial Land Office one morning while he went to speak to someone down the street, leaving her with a stack of papers to look over, deeds and surveys and registration forms. She was patient and careful by nature, the habit of a schoolteacher, and she read each document thoroughly before signing. Most of them were straightforward, but near the bottom of the stack, folded inside another form so that it would have been easy to miss, was a transfer agreement. It was written in clean legal language, and it transferred the mineral rights to her father's land, permanently and irrevocably, to a holding company called Crane Valley Resources, in exchange for the sum of $200, which was appended as having already been received. Her name was at the bottom. She stared at it for a long time. She had not signed this. She had never seen this document before in her life. And yet there was her signature, or something very like it, with the date of 3 days ago, when she had signed a routine survey form that Victor had handed her on the boardwalk without much explanation. She folded the document carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She replaced the stack of papers as she had found them. When Victor returned, she smiled at him and said everything looked to be in order, and he smiled back and suggested lunch. She sat across from him at lunch and watched him with entirely new eyes. She watched how he ordered for her without asking what she wanted. She watched how he talked about her father's land as though it had already in some sense become his. She watched his beautiful, deliberate smile. She thought about Amos Whitfield saying, "If you have any trouble, Miss Boone, you know where the Marshal's office is." She went that afternoon. The Marshal's office was a single rectangular room with a heavy wooden desk, a gun rack, a locked rifle case, and a small iron stove in the corner that was currently doing nothing because it was April and warm. Amos was at the desk when she came in, writing in a ledger with careful, unhurried penmanship. He looked up when the door opened. She came in and closed the door behind her and stood before his desk and placed the folded document in front of him. "I did not sign this," she said, "but that is my signature." He picked it up and read it. She watched his face, which did not change in the way most faces change when they receive surprising information, but something shifted in his eyes, a deepening, an intensification. He set the document down and looked at her. "Where did you find this?" she told him. "All of it." The stack of papers at the land office, the survey form she had signed 3 days ago, the way Victor had positioned himself as her helper, her protector, the way he had spoken about her father. Amos listened without interrupting. He had the quality of a man who understood that silence was the correct response to information and not a vacuum to be filled. When she finished, he said, "This is forgery, Miss Boone, and the transfer of mineral rights without consent is theft. I know that. Victor Crane has done this before," he said. "I have suspected it for some time. I have not had evidence. You have evidence now." "Yes," he said. He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. "I do. I want you to understand what this means. If we move against him openly, he will know you have come to me. He may take steps to protect himself before I can arrest him. What do you need me to do?" He paused. "I need you to go on as you have been for a few more days. Do not let him know you have found this. I need to gather what else I can, and I need to do it quietly." She understood what he was asking. He was asking her to continue performing trust in a man she now knew had been manipulating her, had been using her grief and her loneliness as a tool to steal from her. It was not a comfortable request. "All right," she said. Something passed across his face. It was brief and difficult to identify. It might have been admiration or concern or both at once. "You do not have to do this," he said. "If you want, I can simply arrest him today on what you have given me." "You said you've suspected him before. You need the full case." "Yes. Then I will help you make it." He stood up from the desk and extended his hand. It was the handshake of equals which she had not expected, and which was not common between a man and a woman in Dusthaven in 1882, and which told her something important about Amos Whitfield. She shook it. She walked back out into the afternoon sun and went back to the Copper Crown and changed her dress and met Victor for the evening constitutional he had made a habit of, and she smiled at all the right moments and said nothing about what she knew, and the whole time she was aware of the false document in the inside pocket of her coat, which Amos was now using to build his case. The next 3 days were the strangest of her life. She spent her days with Victor, allowing him to show her more of the territory, allowing him to speak about the future in ways that implied a shared future, because that was what the performance required. She was good at the performance. She was surprised to discover this about herself. She had always thought of herself as transparently honest, the kind of person whose face gave away everything. But grief and necessity had apparently taught her things about herself she had not known. She spent her evenings in the Marshal's office. This had not been planned. It had begun because Amos wanted to brief her on his progress each evening, and then somehow the briefings began to lengthen, and the conversations began to wander outside the business of Victor Crane, and she found herself sitting across the desk from this steady, quiet man, talking about things she had not talked about with anyone in a long time. She talked about her father, about the Tuesday he died, about the way she had been teaching a lesson on multiplication when the neighbor boy came to the schoolhouse door, about how she had walked home knowing before she arrived what she would find. Amos listened. He did not offer the usual consolations, the "he is in a better place," the "he would be proud of you." He simply listened and then said, "He left you the land. That means he knew what you would do with it." Which was a strange thing to say and also exactly the right thing to say. She asked about him. He was measured in response, not evasive but careful, the way a person is careful about something they do not often share. He had come to the territory from Texas at 22, had spent 3 years as a range rider before taking the deputy position under the previous marshal. He was now 29. The previous marshal had retired 2 years ago and left Amos the office and the badge. He had a sister in San Antonio whom he wrote to every month. He had never been married. "Why not?" she asked on the 3rd evening, and then immediately felt forward for asking it. But he considered the question seriously, which was his way. "Haven't found a reason compelling enough to make me stop moving," he said. "I've always been someone who needed to keep moving." "Haven't met someone who made that feel less important than staying." She looked at her hands. "What would that take? Someone who could make staying feel important?" "I don't know," he said. "I suppose I'd have to meet her first." They looked at each other across the desk, and neither of them said anything, and the lamp between them burned very steadily in the still evening air. On the fourth day, Victor asked her to bring the original land deed to the Territorial Land Office. He said it was the final step in the registration process, that they needed the original document to finalize everything. He was warm and confident when he said it, his beautiful smile engaged, his hand briefly covering hers on the table. She looked at him and saw the trap clearly now that she knew what she was looking at. The original deed would be the final piece he needed. With the forged mineral rights transfer and the original deed, he would have everything required to complete the theft. She went to Amos that night. "He wants the original deed," she said. Amos looked up from the papers on his desk. He had been compiling everything, a careful, meticulous record of Victor Crane's operations in the territory, which stretched back 4 years and included 3 similar incidents with other landowners, 2 of whom had left the territory without understanding they had been robbed, and one of whom was a cattleman who had died before he could be informed. Amos had telegraphed the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe and received authorization. He had everything he needed. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning." He stood up. He moved around the desk, and this was the first time he had been physically close to her in any of their evenings together within reach, and she was aware of it with a specificity that surprised her. "You do not need to do this tomorrow," he said. "I have enough now. I can arrest him tonight if you want." "Will it hold?" he considered. "The forged document plus the other cases. It will likely hold, yes. But the territorial judge won't be through until next week, and Crane has resources." His lawyer could argue reasonable doubt on the forgery, so catching him in the act tomorrow would seal it. "Yes," she breathed. "Then I will go tomorrow, but I need you there." "I will be there," he said, simply, without flourish. The way he said everything, which she had come to understand, was not smallness of feeling but rather the opposite, a feeling large enough not to need decoration. She left the marshal's office and went back to the Copper Crown and could not sleep. She lay on the hotel bed in the dark and listened to the desert night, which had sounds she was still learning, the small dry sounds of things moving in the sage, the distant percussion of something she had eventually identified as a nightjar. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about Amos Whitfield standing in his office telling her he would be there, and the particular quality of that statement, which was that it did not admit the possibility of failure. She thought about what came after tomorrow. The land. 300 acres of spring-bloomed desert that she had barely begun to know. The mule named Gerald back in Copper Ridge who she had not yet met. The life her father had apparently believed she would build here, or else why leave it to her, why not sell it, why not give it to the church? He had left it to her because he thought she would stay. He had known her better, perhaps, than she had known herself. She slept eventually and dreamed about the rocky ridge to the north, which in the dream she climbed to the top of, and from the top she could see everything, all the way to Missouri and further, and she was not afraid. In the morning she took the original land deed from the locked box in her trunk and put it in her coat pocket, and crossed the street to meet Victor Crane, who was waiting for her outside the Copper Crown with his patient, calibrated smile, and walked with her toward the Territorial Land Office. What she did not know then, and what Amos had only discovered the night before, was that Victor was not operating alone. He had a partner, a man named Dolph Fitch who worked as a clerk at the land office, who had been the technical architect of the forgeries, and who had been tipped off that the marshal was investigating. Fitch had sent a note to Victor the previous evening. Victor had spent the night deciding how to handle it. He had decided, apparently, to simply take the deed by force if necessary at the land office with Fitch's assistance. He had also decided that Minnie Boone, who had become a liability rather than an asset, needed to be managed. The jailhouse was adjacent to the land office, and Victor had known for years that it was rarely occupied before 10 in the morning, and that the holding cell had a back window with no bars. This is how she ended up with a gun to her head. She had walked into the land office and Fitch was there, wrong, too nervous, his eyes moving between her and the door. And then Victor's hand had been on her arm and the warmth in it was gone, and she understood the whole shape of it in an instant. And Victor said, "Come with me," very quietly, and she had come, through the connecting door into the empty jailhouse, because the gun was already in his hand and she had no other immediate choice. And then the door opened and Amos was there, and she dropped, and it ended. Victor Crane was in the Dusthaven jail by 9:15 in the morning. Doll Fitch was in the adjacent cell by 9:30. Amos had a deputy named Hector Cruz who was stationed at the back window, and a second telegram had gone out to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe the night before requesting a federal judge at the earliest opportunity. Minnie sat on the bench outside the marshal's office, which was where Amos had deposited her with a cup of coffee and instructions to stay there, and she sat and drank the coffee and felt the particular unraveling that comes after sustained tension, the way a rope feels when the strain is finally released. Amos came out after a time and sat beside her on the bench. He was less than 2 feet away from her. He looked at the street for a moment. The normal commerce of Dusthaven morning was going on, a wagon passing, someone arguing amicably outside the general store, a dog crossing the street with the purposeful air of a dog with important business. "You are all right," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she said. "I am all right." "That was very close," he said. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, something that had gotten through the careful steadiness. "Too close." She looked at him. He was looking at the street, jaw set, the muscle in it working. She understood that the steadiness was not absence of feeling but a very deliberate management of it, and that right now the management was effortful. "Amos," she said. She had used his given name without thinking. They had been calling each other Miss Boone and Marshal Whitfield for 2 weeks, and she had simply bypassed all of that in this moment. He looked at her. The directness of it was something she had gotten used to but which still had a particular quality, like being accurately seen. "Thank you," she said, "for coming through that door." "I was already outside," he said. "I followed you from the hotel. I wasn't going to let you go in there alone. You said you would be there." "Yes," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, and the morning went about its business around them, and she thought about ropes and tension and what comes after. What happens now? She asked, "With the case? Territorial judge will be here in a week. The evidence is solid. Between the forged document and his having taken you at gunpoint, he will not be seeing free air for a considerable time. And the land? Yours," he said, "clean and clear. The forged transfer is void. The original deed stands." She looked down at the coffee in her hands. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "that I might stay." She felt him go very still beside her. "In the territory," she said. "I thought I would come here to sort out the land and go back to Missouri, but there's nothing particularly pulling me back. The school will find another teacher. I have 300 acres here. I thought I might see what my father saw in this place." "What did you say your father saw in it?" he asked, and his voice was very quiet. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's part of what I want to find out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a house on the north end of the property, small but solid. Your father built it before his illness made traveling back too difficult. It needs some work. Have you seen it?" "I rode the property line 3 days ago," he said. "When you told me you had inherited it, and I wanted to know what we were dealing with. The house is stone. 2 rooms, good spring nearby. The ridge is a 20-minute ride. You can see all the way to Copper Ridge from the top." She was very aware of him beside her. Very aware of the careful quality of what he was telling her, which was ostensibly about a house but was not entirely about a house. "Amos," she said again. "Minnie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected, simply, directly, the way he did everything, no theater in it, just the name, just her. "If I stay," she said, "would that be something you'd find interesting?" He turned to look at her fully, and the steadiness was there, but underneath it was something much warmer, something she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for the better part of 2 weeks. "Yes," he said, "I would find that very interesting indeed." She smiled. She had not smiled genuinely, unperformed since before her father died, and the feeling of it was unfamiliar and also entirely right, like stepping back into a room you had been gone from for too long. The next week was different. Victor's trial took place on a Thursday, the federal judge having arrived 2 days ahead of schedule, a compact, energetic woman named Judge Loretta Pierce, who had been riding the territorial circuit for 6 years, and who had no patience for elaborate legal maneuvering. Dal Fitch made a deal on Tuesday and provided a full accounting of his partnership with Victor, including 2 additional forged land transfers in Taos and Albuquerque. The case was comprehensive and clear. Victor Crane was convicted on Friday afternoon on charges of forgery, land theft, and unlawful imprisonment with a threat of violence. He was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. Minnie was present for the verdict. She sat in the front row of the church-turned courtroom and listened to Judge Pierce pronounce the sentence, and she felt something close her, something that had been open and raw since the morning she found the document in the stack of papers. Not quite healed, but closed. Amos sat beside her in the courtroom. He had been careful during the proceedings to be professionally proper, to maintain the correct distance between a marshal and a witness in a case he was prosecuting. But he sat beside her in the courtroom and his shoulder was 4 inches from her shoulder. And when the verdict was read, she felt his hand briefly cover hers where it rested on her knee, a single brief pressure, and then it was gone. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, his face professionally composed, and there was the faintest possible ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. She looked back at the front of the courtroom and felt something new move through her, something that was not grief and was not the bleak performing loneliness of the past weeks, and was not the thin warmth she had mistaken for something real in Victor Crane's company. It was the thing underneath all of that, the thing that had been waiting. After the trial, Dusthaven had a dinner. This was its custom for significant events. A long table brought out into the main street, food contributed from every household. A fiddle player named Pete Anselaber who played in the corner with impressive commitment to joy. Minnie sat at the table and ate beef stew and cornbread, and spoke to the woman who ran the general store, whose name was Clara Van, which made Minnie laugh because she had a friend named Clara back in Missouri. Clara Van was 60 years old and had been in the territory since she was 40 and had opinions about everything and delivered them without apology, and Minnie liked her immediately. "That Marshal has been asking about you," Clara Van said, refilling Minnie's coffee with the authority of a woman who considers coffee management a moral responsibility. "Not directly. Indirectly, which is his way. Asked me if I thought you were the sort of person who could take to desert life." Minnie looked up. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you had more spine than most of the men who come through here, which is true, and that the desert tends to keep the people who belong in it, which is also true." Clara Van looked at her with experienced eyes. "You planning on staying, girl?" "Yes," Minnie said, and felt the words settle into something permanent. "Good," Clara said simply, and moved on to refill the next cup. Amos found her after dinner when the fiddle music was in full force and several couples were dancing in the street, their boots raising small clouds of dust in the lantern light. He appeared at her elbow and said, "I was wondering if you danced." "I do," she said. "Do you?" "Poorly," he said, which turned out to be somewhat inaccurate. He was not a showman, but he was steady and he kept good time, which is perhaps more important, and they danced 2 dances while Pete Anselaber worked his fiddle with great enthusiasm, and on the second dance he held her a little closer than the first, and she was aware of every inch of the difference. "I want to show you the house," he said when the second dance ended and they were standing a little off to the side of the main celebration, somewhat closer together than was strictly necessary. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow, if you like." "I'd like that," she said. He rode out with her the next morning, 2 horses making their steady way across the spring desert. She had bought herself a horse the previous week, a bay mare she had named Frances, who had a sensible temperament and a slightly skeptical ear position that Minnie found relatable. Amos rode a buckskin gelding named Cole, whose calm was absolute. The house was on a shallow rise at the north end of the land, built of the same pale stone as the ridge above it, low and solid, with a covered porch facing east toward the morning sun. The roof wanted work in two places, and the porch boards needed replacing, and the single window in the front room was cracked, but the walls were sound, and the spring 20 yards behind it ran clear and cold. Minnie stood on the porch and looked out at the land and the ridge and the enormity of the sky, which was doing something complicated and beautiful with clouds along its southern edge, and felt something she recognized as belonging, which was a feeling she had not had in a very long time. "My father built this," she said. "Yes." Amos was beside her. They were standing at the porch rail looking east. "He must have loved it here. The people who knew him said he was different in Missouri, that he came alive when he came west. Some people are like that with this country." She turned to look at him. "Are you?" "I was born in Texas," he said. "I think it's possible to be born with the West already in you and to spend your life coming toward it." He paused. "I have not ever wanted to be anywhere else." They stood on the porch of her father's house in the April morning, with the spring desert all around them and the ridge above and the enormous sky overhead, and it was entirely natural, entirely simple, and nothing about it was performed. "I am going to fix this house," she said, "and I am going to live in it. And I am going to figure out what to do with 300 acres of desert." "Goats," he said. She looked at him. "Goats. Good for the terrain, hardy, not much water, they'll clear the scrub brush and you can sell the milk and wool. It's what the Navajo families north of here have done for a long time. They know this land better than anyone." She thought about this seriously. "Where would I learn to raise goats?" "I know a family," he said. "The Running Waiter family north of the ridge. They have been on this land for generations. They would know." He paused. "I've had dealings with them for law matters, nothing adverse, boundary questions mainly. Good people. I could introduce you if you want." She turned to look at him fully and found that he was already looking at her with those very direct dark eyes, and the April morning light was on his face, and he looked like a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was trying very carefully not to assume it had arrived. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am going to need a great deal of help, fixing a house and learning to raise goats and learning a new country." "That is a considerable amount of help for one person." "It is," he agreed. "Would you be willing to help me?" There it was, direct, no performance, no calculation. She had learned in the past 2 weeks that this was the only language he truly trusted. "Minnie," he said, and his voice had that quality again, the warmth underneath the steadiness, the thing that did not need decoration. "I would ride through fire to help you." She put her hand on his arm, just that, just her hand on his arm in the morning light on her father's porch, and he covered it with his, the same brief covering pressure as in the courtroom, but this time it did not go away. They stood there for a long time. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of happiness that Minnie had not known was available to her. She moved into the hotel room in Dusthaven while the house was being repaired, and she spent her days learning the shape of her land and her evenings at the Marshal's office, which had become a habit so established that Amos had brought in a second chair from the hotel and placed it across from his desk without comment, and she brought coffee from the copper-crowned dining room without comment, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and talked about everything. She learned that he had a habit of reading, that he had a small collection of books in the room behind the office where he slept, that his tastes ran to history and to natural science, that he had read Darwin and had opinions about it, that he had once spent 3 days tracking a band of rustlers through the Jemez Mountains and had not slept for most of that time, that he had a scar on his left hand from a barbed wire accident at 23, that he told the story of self-deprecatingly and with perfect comedic timing. He learned that she could quote long passages of Shakespeare that she had memorized for her students, that she could do long arithmetic in her head with startling speed, that she had a very precise and unforgiving opinion about pie crust, that she had learned to ride at 8 years old and had never been properly afraid of horses despite a thrown incident at 12, that she had kept a journal since she was 15. "What do you write in it?" he asked one evening. "Everything," she said. "Observations. Things I want to remember, feelings I can't say out loud." "Can you say them out loud now?" She looked at him across the lamp. "Some of them." "What's one you could say?" She took a breath. "That I came here thinking I was coming to settle a matter of business and go home, and that somewhere in the middle of all of it I stopped knowing where home was, and that I have begun to think that home might not be a place at all but a person, and that that is a terrifying thing to think when you have only known the person for a month." The lamp burned steadily between them. He looked at her with those direct, dark, unperforming eyes. "Say the rest," he said. "That I think about you when you are not in the room," she said. "That I think about the way you say my name. That I came here alone and afraid, and you were the first thing in this territory that made me feel safe, and I don't know whether that is the beginning of something or just gratitude for that safety, but I think it is the beginning of something, and I think you know that, and I think you feel it too, and I am very tired of pretending I don't." He stood up from his side of the desk. He came around it. He stood before her, and she stood too, because sitting while he stood did not seem right, and they were very close now, closer than they had ever been except in the dancing, and he raised his hand and touched her face, her jaw, the exact same gesture Victor Crane had made in a cornfield 2 weeks earlier and which had felt like theater, and which felt now like the most true thing that had ever happened to her. "Minnie Boone," he said, "I have been thinking about you since the second day you were in this town. I have been trying to be proper about it because you were in a situation that required professional care, and because I did not want to add any kind of pressure to what you were already carrying. But if you are telling me that you would like me to stop being proper about it, I am extremely willing to do that." She laughed. It came out unexpectedly, a real laugh, surprised and delighted and entirely unguarded. He smiled, the full smile she had only seen occasionally, which was different from any other expression on his face, which made him look young and warm and entirely himself. She stood on her toes and kissed him. He kissed her back. They stood in the lamplight of the Marshal's office on a warm April evening with the desert dark and enormous around Dusthaven, and kissed with the careful thoroughness of two people who have been waiting a long time for exactly this. And when they finally separated, she rested her forehead against his jaw and felt his arms around her and his heartbeat against her ear, and felt the thing that had been asking questions in an empty room finally get its answer. Summer came to the territory, and Minnie Boone's house came together piece by piece. Amos recruited Hector Cruz and 2 of the men from the livery stable for the roof repairs, and a carpenter from Copper Ridge replaced the porch boards, and a glazier who came through on the stage put in a new front window. Minnie painted the inside walls herself, a warm pale color like old cream, and brought her trunk from the hotel and set her things in the house and stood in the middle of the front room and felt it become real. She met the running waiter family on a morning in late May. Amos took her north of the ridge on a long ride, and she met Sina running waiter and her husband James and their adult children, a family who had been on this land for longer than New Mexico had been a territory, who greeted Amos with the ease of long acquaintance and Minnie with a careful courtesy that she tried to meet with equal care. Sina running waiter was perhaps 55, with a calm authority that reminded Minnie of certain teachers she had admired, the kind that does not need to demonstrate itself. She showed Minnie her goats, a healthy herd of mixed Angora and common brush goats, and explained their management with a patient thoroughness that Minnie wrote down in her journal that evening in 6 pages of notes. Minnie began visiting regularly. She went twice a week, riding Francis north through the scrub, and Sina taught her things the land required, which plants held water, which directions the big storms came from, how to read the ridge for weather. In return, Minnie offered to teach Sina's youngest grandchildren to read, which she did on 3 of the afternoons, sitting on the porch of the running waiter home with 4 children aged 6 to 12, and a set of spelling primers she had bought from the Copper Crown store. She told Amos about these afternoons, and he listened with what she had come to recognize as his particular form of delight, which expressed itself as a deepening of attention rather than any visible enthusiasm. "You are teaching again," he said. "I am," she said. "I did not think I missed it, but I find I do. I like children." He looked at her. Something passed through his expression, quiet and thoughtful. "I know," he said. "I can see that." Summer progressed. Her first 12 goats arrived, purchased from a rancher near Albuquerque on Cena running waiter's recommendation, and she spent a full week in a state of mild chaos learning to manage them before they settled into a routine. They were, as advertised, hardy and decisive and not particularly interested in her emotional investment in their well-being, which she found both challenging and endearing. Amos came to the house most evenings. He would ride out after his afternoon round, and they would sit on the porch in the evening cool, and she would have whatever she had cooked for dinner, and they would eat and talk until the stars came out, and then he would ride back to town. On Saturday evenings he stayed longer. On Sundays he came in the afternoon and helped with whatever the land required, the kind of help that is also a kind of declaration, the presence of a man who is learning to belong somewhere. She watched him learn the land alongside her and thought, "This is the most honest thing I have ever seen a man do." One Sunday in July, when the heat was at its merciless peak, and she had come inside at midday, and he had come in behind her, and they were standing in her cool stone kitchen with glasses of water and the relief of shade, he said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" she said. "About the nature of my situation," he said, with the slight care of a man who has rehearsed an opening but not what comes after. "Which is that I am a man who told you he had never found a reason to stop moving. And I find that I am increasingly interested in not moving, which is a significant change." She set down her glass. "Is it?" "It is," he said. "And I want to be precise about why, because I think you deserve precision and not ornamentation. I am not interested in stopping moving because of the land, or because of Dusthaven, or because the case has been interesting, or because it is convenient. I am interested in stopping moving because of you specifically, and because you are the most honest person I have ever met, and the most capable and the most surprising, and I think about being near you the way I used to think about being on the trail, which is that it feels like being most fully alive." She looked at him. The kitchen was very still. The heat pressed against the stone walls and could not get in. "Amos Whitfield," she said, "is that a proposal?" He cleared his throat. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, small and plain, a thin gold band with a turquoise stone that caught the dim kitchen light with a green-blue flash. "It is," he said, "though I am aware that I have not approached it in the conventional order. Minnie Boone, will you marry me?" She took the ring from his hand and looked at it and felt the weight of it, which was slight but significant. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Clara Van's," he said. "She keeps a small selection of jewelry. The turquoise is from the region. She said it was appropriate for a woman who has decided to belong here." Minnie looked at the ring and then at Amos, at his patient, direct face, at the steadiness that was not distance but the opposite of distance, at the man who had come through a door when she needed him and had not stopped being present since. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. Then he put both hands on her face and kissed her in the sun-warmed kitchen of her father's house, and she held onto the front of his shirt and kissed him back, and the desert light came through the window and made everything gold. They were married in September, when the heat had broken, and the territory was moving into the long, mild autumn that Minnie had come to love best of all the desert seasons. The ceremony was in the Dusthaven church, performed by a minister who came from Copper Ridge, and the whole town attended, because Dusthaven was the kind of town that took marriage seriously and treated it as communal property. Clara Van cried and denied it. Hector Cruz stood with Amos and looked proud in a new hat. Cena running waiter and her family came from north of the ridge, and Cena gave Minnie a woven blanket in the traditional pattern that had been in her family, which was a gift of such particular significance that Minnie held it for a long moment before saying thank you in the only language she had. Minnie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, a deep blue that was not quite the color of the sky, and not quite the color of the turquoise in her ring but was somewhere between them. And she walked down the short aisle with her chin up and her heart enormous, and she looked at Amos standing at the front in his good jacket with the badge for once absent from his chest, because today he was not the Marshal but just himself, and he looked at her with those direct, dark, fully present eyes. "I, Minnie Boone," she said when the time came, "take you Amos Whitfield to be my husband." He said his vows in his steady, careful way, and his voice was very quiet and very sure, and when the minister pronounced them married and he kissed her, the assembled Dusthaven let out a collective sound that was half cheer and half something more tender than that, the sound a community makes when something right happens. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the hardest and also the best time of Minnie's life. Hard because the desert winter was a thing she had not fully prepared for, cold in a way that has nothing to do with Missouri cold, dry and sharp, and coming from all directions. And the goat management became complicated, and the house needed additional insulating for the windows, and there were 2 weeks in January when a supply train from Santa Fe was delayed, and the whole territory operated on what it had. Best because she spent it with Amos. He moved into the house fully after the wedding, a process that turned out to involve very little in terms of possessions, a box of books, his saddle and tack, a change of clothes, a shaving kit, the kind of collection that belongs to a man who has always been ready to move and is now, for the first time, actively choosing not to. She watched him put the books on the shelf she had made space for and felt something expand in her chest. He divided his time between the house and the Marshal's office, keeping his residency at both for practical purposes, because a Marshal could not always predict when he would need to be in town overnight. She had a horse and the ride between was 20 minutes and manageable in most weather. They developed the rhythms of 2 people building a life together, the mornings when he was at the house, the evenings when she came to town, the Sunday rides, the kitchen table where she wrote in her journal and he read, the quiet that was not emptiness but fullness, the particular happiness of being in the same room as the person you love without needing to perform it. In February, she told him she was pregnant. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, and he looked up from the book he was reading, and the expression on his face went through several things very quickly: surprise, and then something that was almost undone in a way she had rarely seen from him, and then a kind of joy that she would remember for the rest of her life, enormous and undecorated. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, and she felt him breathe, just breathe, his face in her hair. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said into his shoulder. "Minnie," he said, just her name. Just the way he said her name, which had never stopped affecting her the way it did the first time. She held on to him and felt the spring beginning outside, the desert warming again, the small sounds of her goats in the pen she had built with his help, the whole of the life she had come here not knowing she was going to build, all of it present and real and full. Their son was born in late October of 1883, at the house on the rise, with a midwife from Copper Ridge attending and Amos present in a way that was not conventional for the time, but which he had simply refused to be argued out of. He held Minnie's hand for 6 hours with the patient, steady presence that was the most essential thing about him, and when the baby finally arrived, squalling and enormous and very much himself, Amos held him and looked at him with the expression of a man encountering something he had not known was possible. "What do we call him?" Amos asked. They had discussed names for months. They had lists and reasons for all of them. But looking at this specific child, red-faced and indignant and alive, Minnie said, "Thomas, for my father." Amos looked up at her over the baby's head. His eyes were bright in a way she had never seen, and she understood that this steady, careful man was very close to undone. "Thomas Whitfield," he said, trying it. "Thomas James Whitfield," she said. "James for your father." He had told her about his father in the winter, one of those long evenings by the stove, a man who had died when Amos was 16 and whom he spoke about with a careful, measured grief that she recognized as the grief of someone who has carried it a long time. She had filed the name away. Amos looked at her for a long moment over the head of their son, and what passed across his face was too large and too complete to name. "Thank you," he said. "Come here," she said, and he came and sat beside her on the bed, careful of the tiredness in her, and held her and the baby both. And the autumn night was outside, and the lamp was burning low, and everything they had built was in that room. Thomas was a bright and active child from the beginning, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, which Amos said was a formidable combination, and Minnie said she preferred to think of it as thoroughgoing. He crawled at 7 months and walked at 10, which kept them perpetually entertained and perpetually vigilant, as he was immediately interested in the goat pen and the spring and the ridge, in that particular order. The goat operation had grown by 1884 into a modest but genuine enterprise. Minnie sold milk and Angora wool to 3 buyers in Dusthaven and Copper Ridge, had expanded the herd to 35 animals, and had built a second pen with help from Hector Cruz and the general good will of the community. She had also begun teaching a regular 2-days-a-week school at the Running Waiter property, which had grown to include 7 children from 3 families, and which she ran with the same precise and affectionate methodology she had used in Missouri. Amos watched all of this with a steady and unperforming pride that she could feel even when he said nothing about it, which was much of the time, because he was not a man who spoke praise loosely. When he said something was good, it was good in the way the land was true, without decoration and without question. He had dealt, during these years, with the ordinary and occasional violence of frontier law, a cattle dispute that turned physical in the spring of 1883, a robbery at the territorial stage that he resolved without gunfire through the sheer force of his presence, and a very convincing bluff. 2 men who came through in late 1884 with warrants from the Texas Circuit that he processed carefully and correctly. He was a thorough and fair marshal, which was not as common as it should have been. He extended the same methodical justice to the Navajo and Apache families in the region that he extended to the white ranchers, which was noted, and which was not universally popular, but which he held to with the same immovable steadiness he brought to everything. There were hard moments. There always are. The cattle dispute in '83 left a rancher named Bart Kenfield with a broken arm, and a grudge against the marshal's office that he expressed in pointed ways for most of that year, until Clara Van apparently spoke to him with her customary lack of ambiguity, and the grudge abated. There were 2 weeks in the summer of 1884 when Thomas was ill with a fever that did not break for 6 days, and Minnie did not sleep properly for any of them, and Amos sat with her through the nights with a controlled fear that was the most frightened she had ever seen him. And when the fever finally broke, Thomas sat up in his small bed and asked for goat milk, and Amos walked out to the porch and stood in the night air for a long time. And when he came back, his face was entirely composed except for the redness around his eyes. She went to him on the porch. She put her arms around him from behind, her forehead to his shoulder blade. He covered her hands with his. "Is all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was very steady and very quiet. "Amos, he is all right." He turned and held her hard, the way he almost never held her, without the careful, measured quality just holding. She held back. "I know," he said into her hair. "I know he is. I just needed a minute." "Take all the minutes you need," she said. He laughed, a small sound slightly undone. "You always know what to say." "I'm a school teacher," she said. "It's a professional qualification." He pulled back and looked at her, and he was smiling, that full, real smile that still made something in her respond as though it were the first time she had seen it. He put his hands on her face. "I love you," he said, which was not something he said constantly or lightly, and which every time carried the same weight as the first time he had said it, On a January evening with snow threatening outside and Thomas asleep and the two of them at the kitchen table, when he had set down his book and looked at her for a long moment, and said it very quietly as though he had been certain of it for some time, and was only now finding the right moment to make it spoken. "I love you," she said back, which was also not something she said constantly or lightly, which was one of the things she thought they understood in each other, that the things worth saying were worth saying fully. He kissed her in the doorway of their house in the summer night with their son sleeping safely inside, and she kissed him back, and the stars were enormous above the desert, and the goats were quiet in their pen, and everything was real. In the spring of 1885, two things happened that changed the shape of their lives. The first was that the territorial legislature in Santa Fe passed an education act that provided for formal school funding in territories with sufficient population, and Dusthaven qualified narrowly, and a formal school was authorized. There was no teacher. There had never been a formal teacher in Dusthaven. Hector Cruz, who had joined the school board along with Clara Van and the minister from Copper Ridge, came to Minnie with a formal appointment. She read the appointment letter at the kitchen table while Thomas played on the floor with a set of wooden blocks that Amos had carved for him over the previous winter, block by slow, deliberate block in the evenings, each one smooth and fitted. Amos was watching her read. "The school is in town," she said. 3 miles, he said. "Francis can do it in 15 minutes. Thomas would have to come with me at least for another year. He would enjoy it," Amos said. "He already runs that goat pen like a foreman." She looked at her husband across the table with his patient dark eyes and his slight smile. "You want me to take it? I want you to do what you want," he said. "But I think you would be a remarkable formal teacher, and I think those children deserve one, and I think Dusthaven is lucky to have you. That's a lot of thinking." "I'm a thorough man," he said. She looked at the appointment letter again. Then she looked at her son on the floor, who was currently explaining something at length to one of the wooden blocks in a very serious tone. Then she looked at the window and the land beyond it, her land, her father's land, the 300 acres she had arrived knowing nothing about and had spent 3 years learning to belong to. "All right," she said. "Yes." The second thing that happened was that Amos received a letter from the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe. He brought it home unopened, which was unusual, and set it on the table, and she looked at it and then at him. He sat down across from her. "It's from the governor's office," he said. "I see that. Are you going to open it?" He opened it. He read it. His face did the thing it did when he was receiving information he was processing carefully. He set it down. "They want to appoint me territorial marshal," he said, "for the whole Eastern Territory based in Santa Fe." She looked at him. "Santa Fe?" "Yes." The silence in the kitchen was the kind of silence that matters, that has weight. Thomas was outside now. She could hear him talking to the goats. "This is what you said you never had," she said carefully. "A reason compelling enough to stop moving." "Yes," he said, "and now you have a reason to start moving again." "I have been offered one," he said. He met her eyes directly. "I haven't taken it." "You should think about it seriously," she said. "I am thinking about it seriously," he said. "I am thinking that I have a house on this land and a son and a wife who just accepted a formal teaching appointment in Dusthaven, and that those things are not incidental to the decision." "They are not incidental," she agreed. "But they are also not chains, Amos. I did not marry you to make you small." Something moved in his face. "You could never make me small." "Then tell me what you actually want." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter and then out the window at the land. "I want this," he said. "This specifically, this house and this land and you and Thomas and the goats and Clara Van's terrible opinions about everyone and Hector Cruz's new hat and the ridge in the morning. I want this." He paused. "The governor can find another man." She studied him. She knew how to read him now after 3 years, which was one of the ongoing achievements of her life, because he was not easy to read and she had worked at it with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything. She was reading him now. "Write back," she said. "Thank the governor. Tell him you are committed to Dusthaven." "Are you sure?" "I am sure that you are sure," she said. and that is enough for me." He looked at her across the kitchen table with those eyes, and the gratitude in them was enormous and entirely undecorated, and he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Minnie Whitfield," he said. "Amos Whitfield," she said back. He laughed. She loved the laugh. She thought she would never stop being delighted by the laugh. He wrote back to the governor that evening, a careful and respectful letter declining the appointment with the explanation that his community required his continued presence. The governor wrote back after a month expressing understanding and wishing him well. That was the end of it. The school opened in September of 1885, in a new building that the town had built over the summer, a single-room schoolhouse with good windows and a proper stove. Minnie stood in front of 14 children on the first morning, with Thomas in the front row looking immensely proud of himself for reasons she could only partially identify, and she felt the particular full-circle quality of a moment when a life reveals its shape. She taught school and managed her goat operation, which she had partially handed to a young man from Copper Ridge named Will Tanner, who had a gift for animal management and was glad of the work. Amos continued as Marshal with the same steady thoroughness, increasingly respected in the region, occasionally called upon by the territorial circuit for consultation on complex cases, always returning. Their life had a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary in the way all deeply lived lives are. The ordinary: morning coffee, the ride to school, the evenings on the porch, the Sunday rides when the weather permitted, Thomas's ceaseless and inventive conversation. The extraordinary: the particular way Amos looked at her across a crowded room when they were in town for a community dinner, the way she felt the house come alive when she heard his horse in the yard, the ongoing project of knowing each other more deeply, which she had come to understand was not a project that completed but one that simply continued. In the winter of 1886, she discovered she was pregnant again. She told him in the same kitchen where she had told him the first time, and the expression on his face was the same, the rapid sequence through surprise and undone and enormous joy. He held her the same way, carefully and then not carefully at all. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. Thomas, who was 3 years old and a person of strong opinions, had declared firmly that he wanted a baby sister, which had made both Minnie and Amos try not to laugh. Minnie privately thought it would be another boy, based on nothing at all except a sense she had, which was not reliable but which she had. She was wrong. In July of 1886, in the same bedroom where Thomas had been born, their daughter arrived in the late afternoon, quieter than Thomas had been and immediately apparently interested in looking around at everything, which she did with enormous dark eyes that were already, unmistakably, her father's. Thomas stood at the bedroom door and looked at his sister with an expression that Minnie would carry for the rest of her life, absolute and immediate devotion. He was allowed to hold her very carefully with Minnie's hands under his, and he held her with a seriousness and tenderness that made Amos, watching from the foot of the bed, have to look at the ceiling for a moment. "What is her name?" Thomas asked, with the importance of a person participating in a significant ceremony. Minnie looked at Amos. They had talked about names. "Eleanor," Amos said, "for your grandmother." Thomas considered this. "Ellie," he decided. "Ellie," Minnie said, trying it. She looked at her daughter's enormous curious eyes. "Yes, Ellie Whitfield." Amos sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and they looked at their children, Thomas still holding his sister with immense care, talking to her quietly about the goats and the ridge and the important things she would need to know, and Minnie felt everything she had come to this territory not knowing she needed, entirely present, entirely real. There are certain evenings that become fixed points, markers a life organizes itself around when you look back. This was one of them. The years that followed were good years in the way that takes time to fully see, the way that the value of a thing is sometimes only apparent from a certain distance. Thomas grew into a boy of great energy and genuine kindness, who inherited his father's directness and his mother's precision, and combined them into a person who was interesting to be around, who could fix nearly anything mechanical, who loved horses with a devotion that eventually led to a horse operation on the eastern edge of the land when he was older. Eleanor, who was Ellie to everyone, grew into a girl of considerable will and great curiosity, who taught herself to read at 4 by sitting at the back of her mother's school, who asked questions about everything with an appetite for information that made Amos look at Minnie sometimes as if to say, "Where did this come from?" And Minnie would say, "Look in a mirror," and he would smile the full smile. A third child came in 1889, a boy they named Daniel, who was from the first a peaceful and observant person, the kind of child who sits and watches everything, and then says something so accurate it makes everyone stop. Minnie taught school for 11 years before she retired from the formal position, by which point the school had grown from 14 children to 31, and she had trained 2 additional teachers who took the overflow classes. She continued to teach informally for the rest of her life, the running waiter grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren, anyone who needed or wanted what she had to offer, because teaching was not something she did but something she was. Amos remained Marshal of Dusthaven for 15 years, until he was 44, at which point he accepted the territorial position he had declined in 1885, but on different terms, based in Copper Ridge rather than Santa Fe, with a jurisdiction that covered the Eastern Territory he already knew, with the explicit arrangement that he was home at the house on the rise most weeks. He served in that position for 8 years before retiring to the land full-time, and in his retirement he built things, carefully and slowly, furniture and fences, and a second stone building for the school that Minnie was still running informally. And he read his books and rode Cole's Descendants, and sat on the porch in the evening with his wife, and watched the light change on the ridge. They were sitting on that porch one evening in early autumn, years after the beginning of all of it, when Minnie looked at her husband and thought about the morning she had arrived in Dusthaven on the stage, alone and grieving and carrying a land deed she did not yet understand, and the long chain of everything that had followed. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he could still read her silences, or most of them. "I'm thinking about arriving here," she said, "on the stage, that first day." "You were watching the street with the expression of someone taking inventory," he said. She looked at him. "You noticed me that first day." "Of course I noticed you," he said, with a slight tone of someone gently insulted by the question. "I noticed you from the window of the office. You got off the stage and looked at the street the way you look at something you're deciding about." "I was deciding about it," she said. "I was deciding whether I'd made a terrible mistake." "Had you?" She looked at him, at the silver in his dark hair that he wore better than most men wore their youth, at the particular quality of his face which had aged the way a good landscape ages, into itself, more fully what it was. She looked at the land around them, her father's land, her land, the land her children had grown up on and would know all their lives. She looked at the ridge to the north, which was lit in the late sun in exactly the color she had first seen it in, the pale rose and amber of old stone in good light. "No," she said, "I had not made a mistake." He reached across and took her hand. She looked at their hands together, his and hers, the gold ring on her finger with its turquoise stone that Clara Van had said was appropriate for a woman who had decided to belong here, worn now to a smooth, warm thing that she felt against her skin every day and never stopped being glad of. "I thought about you," she said, "for the rest of that first day after I saw you on the street. I didn't tell you that." "I know," he said. "You know. I could tell," he said, "because you are not as inscrutable as you think you are. I thought about you too. I thought there is a person worth knowing." And I was right," he said simply. The way he said everything, without theater, without decoration, just the true thing clearly stated. She looked at the ridge in the evening light and felt the particular fullness of a life that has arrived at what it was always meant to be, not without difficulty, not without loss, but arrived. Her father's land, her children's home. This man beside her who had come through a door when she needed him, and had not stopped being present, not in 20 years, not once. Thomas was up on the north pasture with the horses. She could see the distant figure of him against the sky, the particular way he moved that was half her and half his father and entirely himself. Ellie was in the house. She could hear her talking, probably to Daniel, who had come home from Albuquerque for the week and who Ellie was apparently explaining something to at considerable length. Daniel's patient voice would be responding. Minnie leaned her head against Amos's shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat in the evening on the porch of the stone house on the rise, with the ridge above them and the desert all around them and the goats quiet in their pen and the horses in the north pasture and their children nearby. And the light changed the way the desert light does at this hour, slowly and completely, turning everything gold. "Do you know what I love most?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "That you are exactly who you were," she said. "You are the same person who sat on a bench outside the Copper Crown and said, 'If you have any trouble, you know where the Marshal's office is.' You are exactly that same person. You have not changed yourself for anything." He was quiet for a moment. "You have made it easy," he said, "to be exactly that person. That is not a small thing, Minnie. That is not a small thing at all." She lifted her head and looked at him. He looked back at her with those dark, direct eyes, unchanged, the eyes she had first seen across a dusty Main Street on an April morning more than 2 decades ago, when she was a new arrival carrying her grief and her land deed and her entire unknown future. She kissed him. He kissed her back, his hand on her face, careful and present, the way he had always been, the way she knew he always would be. The last of the light left the ridge. The stars came out over the desert, enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the smallness of what happened beneath them, which was, in its smallness, everything. Thomas came in from the north pasture. Ellie's voice in the house rose and fell in whatever she was explaining. Daniel laughed at something. The goats made the small sounds that goats make at the end of a day. The desert was dark and enormous and full, the way it had always been, the way it would always be, and on the porch of the stone house on the rise, Minnie Boone Whitfield and Amos Whitfield sat together in the dark and were entirely, completely, irreducibly home.